thank you very much for all coming in and being involved in this webinar. And what I'll intend to do is to go through some of the principles and the work which have developed in the last perhaps 10 years in relation to phosphorus nutrition as it stands in Northern Australia and Northern Australian cattle systems. So if we go back to some real basics, the basics of why we're talking about phosphorus at all, I'm sure most of you have seen that map on the top right-hand side, which is obviously the general map where the red is best estimate done some in the early 90s of country which we would expect to be phosphorus deficient. The green is which areas which expect to be phosphorus adequate, and the yellows are marginal in between. And fairly obviously there's an awful lot of red in that map. If you ask the serious basic questions of why cattle need phosphorus, as has been said many times before, if you've got life, you need phosphorus. It's just really essential to all our animal life, plant life functions. And if we're talking about cattle in particular, then there's a series of reasons why we need it for growth and particularly milk production, and for animals to use the protein and energy that's in the diet anyway. And if we could ask the question, well, what happens if we've got a phosphorus deficiency? Well, the most obvious issues are we get a much lower voluntary intake of feed. It can be reduced by 20, 30, 40%. We get poor growth. We usually get very low breeder herd productivity after a number of years. And I'm sure that those are all the sorts of aspects of phosphorus deficiency and which are most people in the industry would be well aware of. If you ask why we should be particularly concerned about phosphorus deficiency as opposed to the protein or energy or other nutrient deficiencies, I think perhaps the most important issue in here is that generally speaking, we've got our native pasture systems, we've got our tropical grasses, generally growing on pretty infertile soils. There's not much we can do in economic reality of the industry of being able to change that feed base to get higher digestibility grasses on a very large scale basis, or to deal with the problem of nitrogen deficiency, a lot of these tropical grasses during the dry season. Sure, we know that we can deal with it, urea supplements and legumes and so on, but those are other options. And even after consideration of those options, then phosphorus comes up as one which we can hope and expect to deal with in many situations when we've got a phosphorus deficiency. We really do have cattle being limited by phosphorus deficiency in a particular property or paddock or land system. If we go back to the old books, there's such as the McCosker and Winks book of 1994 and the 2012 Phosphorus Manual, or the old work that there's been an agreement across the board about dividing phosphorus in Northern Australia into these categories. And basically, we get phosphorus deficiency because the soils are very low in P. Soils are low in P causes pastures to be low in P, and that leads to a low P concentration in the diet of the animal. And we can put in some broad categories in here that we know that over about 8 units on this bicarbonate soluble P, we're not likely to be seeing P deficiency. And as those soil concentrations decrease, well, we can go from marginal to deficient and acutely deficient. And that's, of course, obviously important from the point of view whether we're dealing with a big problem or a small problem in how we might have to change management. It also has a fairly obvious effect on how much we're likely to reduce live weight change of growing cattle under the marginal or the deficient or the acutely deficient conditions. And those decreases in live weight gain are substantially higher for stylo grass pastures than they are for native pasture. And I can go into that in questions if people are wondering why that's the case. But I mean, obviously the bottom line here is that we can expect very substantial increases if we can fix an acute deficiency or a deficiency of phosphorus, and make a major increase in the annual live weight gain of growing cattle. If we look at the amounts of P required, that's been pretty well worked out by past research, both Australia and overseas. But the really important point in here is that the amount of P per day, you look at that growing steer list, the amount of P an animal needs per day increases enormously, like 5 or 6 times, as it goes from losing weight through to growing rapidly. And that's the story behind why we need to be much more concerned about dietary phosphorus in the wet season, when we've got high energy, high protein, cattle can be growing, as opposed to where we're needing up towards the top end of that amount of diet P. And on the other hand, an animal that's losing weight through the dry season because of lack of low quality pasture, it doesn't need very much P at all. And that's a really important issue in understanding when we need and how we need to provide P. Breeders is a similar story, where we've got milk in there, but of course the milk needs a lot of P, and so therefore we've got to up the intake. Now, if you look at some of the old work here, that plot on the left-hand side is really sort of classical work done in Catherine up in the Territory. And it's really about the argument that if we're looking at live weight gain of steers, then most of the response of phosphorus, like that red line or the difference between the blue and the black, most of that response occurs during the wet season when we've got the good quality pastures. And if we take a growing animal and we supplement in the wet season, then we don't really expect any further response during the dry season in growth of those cattle. You look at the right-hand side plot, that's where we've got some really unusual conditions. Work was done at Lansdowne by David Coates there. And the point there is that he had a really unusual set of seasonal conditions, lots of good feed during the not usual winter, spring, then animals would respond to phosphorus even though it was the dry season. So the big issue in here is that quality of the feed in front of the animals is not because of the month of the year. If we give you another example of breeder cows, this is data from up near Mariba, and done quite some time ago, but it's showing that if we're talking about the dry season from June, July at the beginning of there through to the middle of November, December, then it didn't make much difference. Providing P supplement didn't make much difference to how quickly those breeders lost a lot of live weight during the dry season. But then as they moved into the wet season, then the P deficient animals, they were all lactating because they were at calf. They gained weight only slowly, whereas the P supplemented animals had big increases in live weight. So that's the sort of benefit that we're seeing. Now, we can use that sort of data and a lot of data from the heads of people out there in the industry about what sort of magnitude of increase we might expect to get, or to turn that upside down, of how much we might decrease the productivity of breeder herds under really phosphorus deficient conditions. And if you look at that column effective P supplement, obviously that's the top half is the no supplement and the second half is how much we've increased it. So if we take acutely deficient conditions, we're arguing that under these sorts of conditions you might expect a weaning rate of 77%, and that's saying that under no P supplementation acutely deficient, then we might be getting 57% weaning rate. And we might hope to increase that by 15% with good effective P supplementation, but we probably won't get it back up to the 77% like the P adequate herd because of sort of all sorts of other reasons, as that's generally poorer country. So you can look at those numbers, and obviously the biggest effects are associated with a greater degree of P deficiency, and it's possible to use those numbers to then start to argue about whether we should be spending money using inputs to, most obviously, phosphorus supplements to solve a problem, and what the economics of that are likely to be. And for those of you who have missed it in the past, Fred Chudley, of course, and Marie Bowen have been doing some really good work on the economic responses to P supplementation. And if you want to follow that story, then their webinars would probably be a very good place to go to. This is a reminder of the work you would have seen by Tim Schott, shown a couple of weeks ago on the Victoria River Downs area up in the Territory. And the work they've been doing where they're dealing with really extreme P deficiency conditions, getting massive responses in terms to P supplementation, but the responses they're getting there are appreciably higher than I was showing in that table a moment ago. And the reason there is that when we drew up that table, we thought we should be pretty conservative about this is what we think we are likely to get on a commercial property situation, as opposed to what you might achieve, was possible to achieve under more extreme conditions, under research station conditions. So if we sum up the questions of what pea supplementation does to breeder herds, we expect to get fairly major increases in weaning rate, mortality. Most of it seems to be a function just of body weight and live weight of the breeder, and there's certain specific conditions of younger cows being more susceptible, and there being quite often quite a bit of variability between years. So all of that work led to the long-standing advice that's been around for a long time, since about 1990, and it can be summed up in the line of feeding P in the wet and nitrogen in the dry, and some extra P for lactating cows or late pregnant cows in the dry. And the logic of that was, at that time, that followed through from all of the information they had at the time, and there was a lot of logic in what they did. But what we've learned since then is that there's also a pretty major difference between the way the breeder cow behaves in late pregnancy and early lactation and the way a growing steer behaves. And it's what has been shown from a lot of work in a lot of areas around the globe, is that any mammal, whether it be beef cattle or dairy cattle or goats or sheep or humans, can all mobilize calcium and phosphorus in late pregnancy, early lactation if they have to, and put it back later. And that was never appreciated when they were drawing up the original 1990 recommendations. And the other part of this, of course, is there's been a lot of producers out there who've continued to feed P in the dry season and at least alleviated the worst of their problems with P of doing so. So that sort of information was really important and has given us a new way of asking the question of, to what extent might we expect to be able to P supplement breeders in the dry season and get benefits from that. So if it's going to happen, then the argument is it's probably going to mostly happen because that breeder cow in late pregnancy, last month of pregnancy, in the first 3 or 4 months of lactation, she can pull phosphorus out of her own bones to keep her going and meet that diet deficiency. So, and this is going back to this experiment of the Mariba a few minutes ago, and in measurements in that experiment showed that these breeder cows over that 12 months could mobilize about 30% of their skeletal P, of the phosphorus in their bones. And when you work through the sums of how much P is in the skeleton of a cow, that adds up to a lot of P. There's some other really good work which came out of South Africa, which has probably not got the recognition it's deserved. This is a 5-year experiment, and what they did was they took heifers in good P condition in early pregnancy, and they fed them in paddocks of very P deficient or P adequate for 5 years. You look at those live weight differences of the blue plus P supplement, the black without P supplement, over the first year. Sure, there was an effect on P live weight, but it wasn't that great. But what they also showed was that what was really important was the big differences happened in years 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, especially in years 3 and 4 and 5. And you can see those differences here in the cow live weight being well over 100, 120 kilos at the end of the wet season, with very low blood P concentrations and very large effects on the amount of P in the skeleton. So what it was showing that there's a knock-on effects, and the effects of the P deficiency in breeders is not so much the first year, because they can mobilize P in that first year, but they can't mobilize P up past a certain point, and that's why you get these big adverse effects in the subsequent years. And if you look at their calving rates and their weaning weights, then it tells the same story. If you look at the right-hand side in the blue, there are differences in weaning weights going up 60 to 70 kilos as a consequence of P supplementation. Now, this is a situation, a research station, where they had extremely P deficient soils like Victoria River Downs, or possibly worse, but it really shows well how important it is that we're seeing knock-on effects in years 3, 4 and 5 of P deficiency more than especially in year 1. So we can work through the sums, the calculations of how much P an animal, a breeder cow, might be able to mobilize if she's coming into calving in high P condition. And you can work through those calculations, and the conclusion is that she can provide up to about 6 or 7 grams of P per day out of her bones, and that's about 1/3 of her P requirement, or about the amount of P supplement that we'd normally expect to feed anyway, of the 6, 7, 8 grams. That led us into a major project which has come to an end, supported by MLA with DAF as a major collaborator, And it's asked a series of questions about what's the evidence that our northern breeders can mobilise pea to meet their short-term needs. If we mobilise it, it's like getting an overdraft out of the bank. If you take phosphorus reserves out of the bones, you've got to put them back in again if you want that cow to calve each year. And so can a breeder replenish pea during the dry season? And then what could we do about improving our markers? First experiment, for example, we did this in 2 separate experiments, where in each of those experiments we fed diets, a pea deficient diet of only 20 or 30% of their calculated requirements or their full requirements. What happened? The pea deficient cows ate considerably less feed, by about 20-25%, and there was an effect of calf live weight after 3 months, but not an enormous effect. But the really big effect in here was what that did to the cow live weight. And this was the old story where these breeders were stripping their own live weight, both fat reserves and phosphorus reserves, during that first 100 days. So they lost about 50 kilos, the pea deficients lost about 50 kilos, 60 kilos more than the pea adequates. And so sure, in the first year, if we've got a cow in good body condition, she can cope with producing a lot of milk for that first lactation, but she does so at the cost of her own body reserves. If we look at that bottom line of the phosphorus balance, that tells us when we're doing our calculations, and that -6, for example, in the pea deficient cows in each experiment is saying that these cows were drawing or mobilising, withdrawing about 6 grams of phosphorus per day from their own bodies. And that, of course, has knock-on effects. So we take that first question, the question 1, and the answer is that certainly if we've got mature cows, there's a major capacity to mobilise pea in early lactation. First calf cows, there's some capacity, but it's not nearly as great as it is in the mature breeder. If we ask the question 2 about can we put phosphorus back into the reserves of the cow during the dry season, replenishment, there's also produced evidence that we can get considerable replenishment, including in an animal which is like a first calf cow, a pregnant heifer, which is losing live weight rapidly during the late pregnancy period. What about the marker story? Can we come up with better diagnostics? The answer is that yes, we're making progress in that area, and we've had the pea screen test out there for a couple of decades, 20 odd years. We think that we can move towards a pea screen 2, which will considerably improve our ability to diagnose pea deficiency. What are the implications for people like many of you who actually have the hard cold face of managing cattle through our dry seasons? The old recommendation of feeding, sorry, to go back a bit, just sure cows can use their pea reserves, but that we've got to replenish those pea reserves if we're going to expect that cow to calve every year as opposed to every second year, as happens in some really pea deficient situations. And the other thing to consider in here is there are really simple things that we can do. If we've got breeders grazing better pea country for some of the year, chances are they can replenish some of their pea reserves without ever buying pea supplements, but that's more speculation. We haven't got information on it at the moment. Another thing to bear in mind is that don't forget when a cow's lactating, there's a lot of phosphorus going out in that milk, and so therefore the earlier we can wean that calf, the better we look after the breeder. And for some people it might be worth considering getting those calves off earlier, not supplementing the breeder cow, but putting that money into the calf instead. So what does it mean in terms of our recommendations? The old recommendation of feeding pea in the wet season is still the best way to approach the issue, we believe. If you're dealing with really pea deficient country, then there's also logic to feed a low amount of nitrogen supplement and pea supplement during the late dry season. And we'd say if you're going to feed pea supplement during the dry season, it's important to feed some nitrogen supplement with it, because there's some old work from South Africa suggesting that if you feed pea and you've got a really serious nitrogen deficiency, you can actually have, you'll probably have no effect, or worse, you might even have an adverse effect on that cow. But there are lots of very obvious reasons why it's very difficult or not possible to feed pea supplements during the wet season. Then our suggestion or our recommendation would be to feed the pea supplements for as long as possible as much as possible of that wet season, for example, getting pea supplements out before the break and starting again as soon as possible after the creeks have gone down and it's possible to get transport around. And the other issue in here, of course, is that senesced pastures are usually pretty low in P, so that if you've got cows calving in the dry season on a senesced pasture, then they'll need extra P supplements as well. If we talk about if we feed P and N supplement during the dry season in late pregnancy, we should be able to increase bone P stores, which should be usable later on in the lactation of the animal. But don't forget that if we're running an animal into the situation where it has to use its P reserves and it's in P deficiency, then we're going to run down those reserves, and it's also going to eat less feed. So we're going to have it's going to reduce live weight for that reason alone. One way of looking at this is that we all know that the principles of managing breeders and aiming to maintain body condition score, so they're calving in pretty reasonable body condition. I think many of the same arguments apply to trying to conserve body phosphorus reserves, but we do have the big problem there at the moment is that we've got no easy way of measuring the phosphorus reserves of an animal on a commercial property. I would put in a word of caution about this though, in the sense that all of these recommendations are based on the intensive work on research stations with animals in pens with intensive measurements. All of these recommendations are based on what an animal is doing in a pen situation in really intensive tight control. We've got no reason to think the field situation should be different, that grazing animals should behave in a very similar way, but we haven't got the field trials to demonstrate that and show that in practice. So we do suggest there needs to be a bit of caution about how these recommendations are used and accepted until we've got more information over the next few years.